also first say that I agreed to also discuss the G20 at short notice, about 3 minutes notice actually. so my presentation won't be as lucid as I'd hoped. But in any event, I think that the theme that I wanted to develop is of relevance both for a discussion on NAMA11 and the G20. And indeed, I did agree to join this panel when Nagesh invited me because I was beginning to do some thinking myself on how to conceptualize the history and the development of these coalitions, the G20 and NAMA11, since the Doha round began. And so I share with you some of my thoughts, which are still in its formative stage. And then as you respond to them, I hope that we can develop some of these ideas a bit further. And then I look forward to your comments on my next paper, which will be based on this. Well, as I thought about this, I was reading Amartya Sen, and his book on the title, The Argumentative Only. And in one of his chapters, he talks about the role of women in society. And in this chapter, he says that in the early stages of their development, and he's talking about the women's movement in India, these movements concentrated mainly on women's rights, on their own issues. And he called this, their welfare, the welfareist approach, or welfare focus, because of the own issues. But gradually, as the movement developed, it began to broaden its perspective and its horizons. And it began to also campaign not only for women, but also for men, and for children, and for the society as a whole. This reminded me really, and he called this, by the way, a movement from a welfarist role to an agency role. And this reminded me very much of, my own little experience, and I'm glad in the audience, some of my former colleagues from my earlier past are here, reminded me of my early work in the trade union movement in South Africa, where in the early stages of that movement, we focused really on trade union rights, which was, the right to resist as a trade union to bargain. But as the unions developed, of course, they began to assert their rights as citizens for the vote, for democracy, for non-racialism, and become a vital pillar of our democracy. So from a narrower, welfarist interest to a broader perspective and incorporating the interests of society as a whole. So similarly, I wanted to sort of have a look at these movements, the G20 and the NAMA11, from the point of view of how they began to develop, focusing on some of their own interests in the multilateral trading system, and how gradually over time these movements or coalitions began to also take on board the interests of other groups, notably the groups like the RDCs, the ACP, Small Vulnerable Economies, and incorporate those into their own positions through strengthening alliances with these other groups. And I dare say that the first steps towards an even broader perspective, which is to talk about, to begin to take on board the broader global governance. This is the theme of your paper, global governance, which is, in my perspective, how would we like to see a fair and balanced and strengthened multilateral trading system? What does this mean for us? And how do we translate this institution into what some academics have called a global public good, something that is of benefit to all, not only developing countries, but also the developed countries. So, so in the same way that women were fighting for women's rights, and then also for the rights of men, how do we, advance and aim this role of agency? Well, if you look at the history of the G20, when it started in Cancun, just before Cancun, the G20 was formed. It was formed really firstly to prevent the imposition of a deal which was unfair. Because when the EU and the US got together in June of 2003 to discuss how to accommodate each other's interests and finally reach an agreement in August, this agreement between the EU and the US reduced the ambition of the round for everybody and would prevent the development outcome that developing countries who had agreed to the launch of the Doha round, or some of them were reluctant. They agreed to this on the understanding that the main issues which were of development concern to them would be addressed this time. And the chief amongst those issues was agriculture. And here we had an agreement between the EU and the US which was reducing the possibility for any real development outcome for the historical backlog in the rules on agricultural trade would not be addressed. And so countries like India and Brazil, which had been had taken quite different positions in the WTO before June of 2003, because as you know, India is a large country with a large number of very small farmers, average of 1 to 2 hectares, and generally uncompetitive and not a major exporter of agricultural products, whereas Brazil is almost the reverse of that, with enormous capacity, the supply capacity and potential, and the capacity to compete in the world. And yet these two countries were able to work together and develop a common approach, bringing together others like South Africa, China, Argentina, Mexico, Chile, and a range of other countries together just before the Cancun meeting and during the Cancun meeting, and had effectively blocked the EU and US from getting the joint framework agreement, the EU-US joint framework agreement agreed in Cancun. Of course, the relationship between the G20 then and other groups was tenuous in Cancun. Others were a bit wary of the G20. Even the LDCs and those who suffer from preference erosion, they were seeking, they were wary of the G20's positions on these issues, which were not clear at all, because the G20 was in its formative stage. But as we got to the July Framework Agreement in 2004, we began to see a greater strengthening of the relationship between the G20 and other groups in the WTO. And if you look at the G20 statements, you will see that they have already begun to take on board the need to address very complex issues like preference erosion. And indeed, a large number of countries in the WTO who are outside the G20 also had interests inside the G20, because the G20, as you know, is a complex set of countries. It has not only countries like Brazil and India, but also countries who are net food importing countries like Egypt, LDCs like Tanzania, so-called small and vulnerable economies like Paraguay, Guatemala. So it has a sort of almost a representation of the whole of the membership. But of course, the interest of those other groups, including the interest of small producers like India, are really represented much more effectively by other coalitions like the G33, the LDC group, the ACP group. And so the G20 had to work amongst its own members, but then also build relationships with these other groups to attempt to address some of the issues of concern to these members. And I think by the time we got to the Hong Kong meeting in December of 2005, these relationships had begun to solidify. So for the first time, we had in Hong Kong a meeting at ministerial level of all these groups, the G20, the ACP, the LDC group, the SVEs, all coming together in the sort of G110 or 120 countries. All the developing country groups meeting at ministerial level. And I happened to be at that meeting, and the meeting was not orchestrated. It was a very spontaneous response to what was going on in Hong Kong. And in Hong Kong, we saw the EU really being extremely defensive and struggling to even concede to the issue of the elimination of export subsidies. And so these groups got together and united behind the demand for the substantial reduction of domestic trade distortion and domestic support. All these groups totally united, 100% behind this common position of domestic support and the need to eliminate export subsidies. Now, so the G20 has continued to work in this direction of strengthening and working on these issues. By no means have these issues all been resolved, but the work is currently in progress. There's a high level of confidence between the G20 and these other groups about the need to address these issues in a way which is fair, both to the large producers and exporters and to the smaller producers and exporters. Because the large producers and exporters, those who are very competitive, who also are in the Keynes group, like Brazil and Argentina and others, including South Africa, by the way, also have an interest to export to other developing countries, including India and Indonesia and many African countries. And so we need to find a way in which we can balance the interests of the exporting countries, developing countries, exporting countries, and those who have difficulties because they are uncompetitive and they're also dealing with a number of other externalities like subsidies by rich northern countries. And so one of the key issues in the negotiations right now is this question of special products and how it is resolved. And it is the issue of special products and the SSM is not only one between the United States and India, that's what you read in the press, or the United States and the G33, but it's also an issue which the G20 itself will have to resolve. And we are all confident in the G20 that it will be resolved in a way which is beneficial to both sides of the equation in G20, because we have countries on both sides. But of course, it will have to, the final decisions on that will have to await the US move on domestic support. Now, similarly, the NAMA11 was created much later, sometime in just before the Hong Kong ministerial meeting. In fact, the first ministerial meeting of the NAMA11 took place in Hong Kong. And the reason why it took a bit long for a coalition to form in NAMA, that is on industrial tariffs, non-agricultural market access, was because there was a lot of debate amongst developing countries about which formula would best suit their interests, and because amongst developing countries, even the larger developing countries, their industrial structures and tariff structures are quite different. And so how to find a formula which suited the particular situation was quite difficult. And so we had different formulas before the Hong Kong ministerial. But as we got to the Hong Kong ministerial meeting, both the EU and the US put up proposals October 2005, which began to raise the stakes in NAMA on industrial tariffs. And they had called for the so-called Swiss formula of 15 for developing countries, which would mean sort of a 70% cut on average for these countries on a line-by-line basis, with the Swiss formula, which works in a fairly deep way and makes deep cuts in industrial tariffs. So these developing countries then felt the threat of the pressure from the EU and the US and came together in the NAMA11, led by Brazil, Argentina, India, South Africa, Egypt, Tunisia, Philippines, Namibia. And since then, they've also had to grapple with a number of concerns of those countries who were not part of the NAMA11 and were not part of the same group of countries and that would have to undertake a formula cut. So countries outside of this would be those countries who call themselves small and vulnerable countries, who say that since they're developing countries, but they are smaller than the bigger ones, and they should be given a little bit more flexibility. And they made this demand, they've been making this demand since the round started. But bigger developing countries were somewhat reluctant to agree to this because, like in agriculture, even in industry, the bigger developing countries also have an interest in South-South trade and exporting to other developing countries. So there was some reluctance about this initially. And then the issue of preference erosion. So those countries who have preferences already to the EU and the US feel threatened by tariff liberalization and have been asking for some compensation or some way of managing this so that their current preferences will not be eroded dramatically, resulting in a negative impact on their development. But of course, here the interests of these groups of developing countries are victory, and we had to find a way of how to manage this. And it's taken a bit of time, but I think that as we got to the post-Hong Kong period, the suspension, remember in June, July 2006, the round was suspended because of the lack of movement in agriculture by the EU and the US. And at this time, by this time, the NAMA11 had worked to a large extent with many of these countries on all these issues, on preferences, the issue of small and vulnerable economies, and particularly on the question of duty-free, quota-free market access. This was a very interesting question because the LDCs asked not only the developed countries for duty-free, quota-free market access, they also asked the larger developing countries, the so-called more advanced developing countries, they asked them for duty-free, quota-free market access. And initially, there were, some concerns about this because, of course, even a country like South Africa has to go through a lot of consultations at home. There are difficulties with the trade unions about how to manage this, and we ourselves have adjustment problems and employment problems, so how to deal with this. But there has been, even in the period just before Hong Kong, but during Hong Kong and subsequently, a lot of discussion within Brazil, India, China, and several of these countries. And now the position of the NAMA11 is firmly behind the LDC demand for duty-free, quota-free market access, not only in the developed countries, but also in the so-called more advanced developing countries. Of course, the pace of that will have to be slightly different because of the differences in industrial structure in the NAMA11 countries. But the commitment to work towards trying to provide some significant duty-free, quota-free market access to LDCs has been made. And again, the issue of preference erosion, which also affects the bigger developing countries, because if the developed countries are allowed longer, say, implementation periods for reduction commitments, this will help to give more time for adjustment to the preference receiving countries, but it will impact negatively on those countries who have been struggling for years to try and get better market access into the developed countries. So there is a tension there, but the NAMA11 has taken a decision at ministerial level in June, July of last year, and has restated this in position papers that was made in the WTO, that it is willing to agree to these longer implementation periods, although it will delay their own interests in getting market access, in the interests of addressing the real concerns of the preference receiving countries. So a lot of movement has taken place. There's still some way to go. And whilst this has been happening, I think that both the G20 and the NAMA11, and indeed other groups, coalitions in the WTO amongst developing countries, have had to think very seriously about the Doha round, the multilateral trading system, and what it all means. And whilst outside, some of the NGOs and civil society are saying that the round is dead, and why waste your time, and nothing is happening. But we, inside the system, we believe, increasingly, I think the view amongst developing countries is that the agenda we put on the table in Doha is an agenda not only for the immediate resolution of the immediate concerns of many of us, our countries, but also it is an agenda for a future vision of what a truly fair, balanced, and development-oriented multilateral trade system should be. And as I was saying to some of some friends, I was speaking to another meeting a couple of weeks ago from civil society. I was saying that if there wasn't a WTO, we would want to create one, because in today's world, we are trying to build better systems of global governance, better rules to manage trade, to manage globalization, so that we can share the benefits amongst all of us. And we, amongst the developing countries, are not afraid to engage. And indeed, if you look at the history of the last few years, one of the important lessons in science for hope is that developing countries have been able to organize, they've been able to develop the technical capacity through sharing this amongst themselves, and they have been able to negotiate quite effectively, I think in many cases, to prevent unfair deals and to put on the agenda issues which have been carried forward. And if you take the G20, for example, most of the concepts the G20 put forward have been carried. And indeed, the G20 is seen now as the center ground in the negotiations. In other words, as the bridge builder, as the group that everyone else must move towards, both the EU and the US and the G10, Japan and others. And that is sort of agreed, even the EU agrees to that. So this is a tremendous advance, I think, for the coalitions that have been built, the G20 and NAMA11. And I dare say there's a lot of work still to be done, but some of that will have to be done in the course of debate and discussion amongst academic society. So